Fish 30. Diet and Veganism. Preamble. Even though the term vegetarian has customarily referred to a human who desists from eating animal flesh, but who may still consume animal byproducts such as eggs and milk, here it is used literally, that is, one who subsists on vegetation. One who consumes vegetation, dairy and/or eggs, is properly called a lacto-vegetarian, or a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, respectively. The term vegan is not directly related to diet, but to the ethical norm of the avoidance of unjustifiably harming animal life. Animal killing can be permissible in certain circumstances, as it will be fully explained further down. Clearly, veganism is to be promoted as the ideal way of life, since vegetarians are definitionally carnists. At the risk of nitpicking, both the words vegetarian and vegan refer to those humans who subscribe to those two notions, and not to the food products themselves. Even if one was to qualify the term diet with the word vegetarian, e.g., I consume a vegetarian diet, it would not provide a great deal of information, since those who consume a raw fruit diet, as well as those who consume only soda drinks and candy, could both claim to consume a vegetarian, vegan diet, and nobody would agree that these two diets are comparable in any significant way. NB. If you are reading this, it is highly probable that you are familiar with the concept of the three modes of nature, triguna, in Sanskrit. If not, it is recommended that you read, or reread, Chapter 18 of A Final Instruction Sheet for Humanity, FISH, at this point. In any case, those who are, in fact, familiar with the three modes of nature, have an extremely flawed understanding of how they apply to food and diet, particularly if they have studied the ancient Indian texts known collectively as Ayurveda, the science of life, longevity. Those persons invariably believe that animal products are categorized in the mode of darkness. However, this assumes that animals are factually human food, which they definitely are not. The system outlined below is, by far, the most accurate, logical, and authoritative method of classifying food, and ought to be followed by anyone who is truly desirous of living a wholesome life. Unfortunately, even most vegetarians and vegans seem to lean towards less than ideal diets. Of course, it is morally preferable to consume a poor plant-based diet rather than eating murdered animals. One of the greatest tragedies is that throughout history, the vast majority of diets have consisted of dead foodstuffs, and non-human food. Foods in the three modes. There are three kinds of foods, according to the three modes, explicated in Chapter 18 of this, A Final Instruction Sheet for Humanity. Foods in the mode of purity, sattvaguna, in Sanskrit, promote good physical and mental health. The adage, healthy body, healthy mind, is pertinent to this mode. Such foods include, in approximate order of their importance, fruits, especially if they are tree-ripened, vegetables, nuts, legumes, pulses, grains, roots, flowers, tubers, bulbs, and of course, purified water, or milk, in the case of infants, supplemented with seeds and herbs. To be included in this classification, the food must be living, that is, fresh and raw, or at most, steamed or lightly sautéed, if one is residing in a cold clime. Most animals subsist on living foodstuffs, so to be considered healthy, the food must be both living and natural. As with all herbivorous mammals, humans who consume a pure diet normally experience a bowel movement after each substantial meal. Foods in the mode of passion, rajas guna, in Sanskrit, promote indigestion, or, at least, are more difficult to digest than pure foods, and overly excite the mind. Such foods are basically the same as above, but with a certain quantity of oil, spices, sweeteners, salt, and/or other condiments added. To be included in this category, the plant-based foods may be properly cooked, but not overcooked, and moderately to mildly seasoned. Those who consume foods predominantly in the mode of passion normally defecate after breaking their fast, i.e., breakfast. Foods in the mode of darkness, tamas guna, in Sanskrit, cannot rightly be called food at all, and invariably cause digestive upsets, such as constipation or diarrhea. Such offal is either dry, stale, putrid, rancid, decayed, carcinogenic, overcooked, or even worse, burnt, processed beyond recognition, bitter, or the remnants of another's meal, that is, food that has been left over by a person who is lower in the hierarchy of society than the person who intends to consume it. For example, it would be offensive for a beggar to offer the remains of his meal to his king, yet the converse would be a rather benevolent act. Again, to be included in this classification, the food is to be of wholly plant or fungal origin. The ideal diet. Ideally, the bulk, if not all, of one's diet should comprise of minimally processed raw foods, such as tropical fruits or vegetable salads, the latter of which often consists of fruits anyway, because such foods as tomatoes, cucumbers, and olives are, in fact, fruits, since they are seed-bearing foods. If one consumes a very high proportion of raw fruits, it is rarely, if ever, necessary to fast. Fasting is beneficial for those who partake in a diet high in processed and cooked dishes. Fruit juice fasting is perhaps the best method of fasting, especially for those living a vigorous lifestyle. Unless one is particularly active, eating more than 2 meals per day is unnecessary. Ideally, cooked and highly processed foods should be reserved for the final meal of the day, since the process of digestion itself consumes more energy than any other activity. Ideally, one should sit in a comfortable position, and eat one's meal with a relaxed mental disposition. Consuming food in an anxious state of mind may cause digestive upsets. If practical, it is suggested that eating with bare hands is more conducive to the enjoyment of one's meal. In case the reader may be wondering what this author, the current world teacher, usually consumes, the following is my typical daily meal plan. Upon waking from sleep, I rinse my mouth with a mixture of commercial mouthwash, a drop of clove oil and tea tree oil. Then, I drink at least 1 cup of purified water, mixed with a couple of vitamin tablets, definitely vitamin B12, and when I am residing in a location that receives little direct sunlight, vitamin D also. After 2 or 3 hours, I break my fast with either a bowl of oats, mixed with raw and dried fruits, chia seeds, raw cacao nibs, moringa powder, and sweetened soya drink, inaccurately called soya milk, by many persons, plus a handful of mixed nuts and seeds, or else, I prepare a large fruit salad, ideally, using as many tropical fruits as can be afforded, plus a variety of nuts and seeds. For my second and final meal of the day, I prepare a mixed salad, invariably consisting of Roma tomatoes, cucumber, lettuce or alfalfa sprouts, raw beetroot, black olives, a gherkin, pickled cucumber, a type of herb, coriander, parsley, oregano, etc. A teaspoon of ground seeds, chia, sesame and flax, and dressed with extra virgin olive oil and apple cider vinegar. The salad is eaten with a cooked dish. I am particularly fond of Indian, Italian, Mexican, Chinese, and Lebanese recipes, plus a side snack like corn chips, and after a while, I consume dessert with soya drink. Humans are herbivores. It is an incontrovertible scientific fact that humans are a herbivorous species, more specifically, a predominantly frugivorous, or fruit-eating animal. There is not a single aspect of human psychology or physiology that even suggests that we were designed or evolved to feed on our fellow animals. The primary visual cortex of the brains of hominids has precisely evolved to recognize the colorful fruits that grew in the tropics of the African continent. In previous decades, the main objection to a pure vegetarian diet was the assertion that they lacked sufficient protein, but now that such silly arguments can easily be discredited by any competent dietitian, possibly the chief objection proffered by carnists is that humans possess canines. Firstly, our canine teeth are quite distinct from those of a carnivorous species, and function rather differently. Carnivores rip off their food purely in an up and down motion and quickly swallow the morsels of meat lightly masticated, that is, they minimally chew their food, whilst humans and other herbivores bite their food with their incisors and/or their canines, and grind their finely masticated plant food using the molar teeth. The solitary evolutionary purpose of human canines was to bite into the harder varieties of vegetation, such as apples, carrots, and root crops. Of course, in modern times, Because humans consume an overwhelmingly large proportion of processed and cooked foodstuffs, we rarely need to employ our canines. Secondly, the animal with the largest canines, the hippopotamus, is a herbivore, because despite what many carnists may claim, canine teeth are useful for tearing into raw vegetation, not only dead animals. Even though, as so rightfully stated in the previous paragraph, there is no feature of Homo sapiens that indicates anything other than a strict herbivorous creature, the following bullet points have been listed for the benefit of those readers who are likely to doubt this truism. The fact is, even the vast majority of vegetarians and vegans believe that humans are omnivores, due to societal conditioning and lack of study. Most importantly of all, unless one is an extremely ferocious troglodyte, probably with an intelligence quotient below 60, also, we humans have not the slightest inclination to hunt down animals with our bare hands and eat them in their freshly killed state, just like an actual omnivorous, carnivorous animal. The overwhelming majority of humans claim to be animal lovers, though the diets may belie this assertion. Just as we humans are naturally not disposed to jumping on cows, sheep, pigs, goats, and chicken in the wild, and feasting on the bloody bodies, omnivorous, carnivorous animals are generally unafraid of human beings. Witness the difference between a cow, for instance, spotting a big cat, such as a cheetah, and seeing a fellow herbivore, such as a human being. They are greatly more frightened by the big cat or by a wolf. Not only are our teeth more akin to those of the typical herbivore, they are even more herbivore-like than our nearest relatives. The great apes, such as chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, have far larger canine teeth than do we humans, since they feast mainly upon leaves, stems, pith, and shoots, whilst we humans are predominantly frugivores, or, at least we should be, but our diet has degraded over the ages. Whilst humans have fingernails, they are not suited to clawing at prey, in the same manner as omnivorous, carnivorous animals. Of course, carnists will retaliate with, but we have invented weapons for hunting. But that suggests that we are not actually omnivorous, carnivorous animals, and can catch prey only with the help of artificial tools. Most animals can outrun a human, as we did not evolve as speedy carnivores. Omnivorous, carnivorous animals usually consume the entrails of their prey immediately upon their kill, because the intestines contain the majority of nutrients and are higher in liquid content. They would either leave the musculature for another day, or simply abandon the carcass, depending on how plentiful is their food supply at the time. Humans typically eschew the intestinal organs, in favor of the meat on the bones. The digestive tract of omnivorous, carnivorous animals is far shorter in length than herbivorous animals, and is greatly more acidic, because meat decomposes far more quickly than does vegetation, at least raw vegetation, which is what we ought to be eating, at least in the main. So, the digested meat, in the intestinal tract of carnivores, needs to be digested and assimilated within a short time, in order to avoid spoilage. Carnivorous animals eat only a couple of times per week, whilst omnivorous animals rarely consume more than one meal per day. Obviously, this is the case in their natural state, since domesticated animals are spoiled by their human owners. If someone was to ask you to consume but 2 or 3 meals per week, for the remainder of your life, do you think that you would be able to maintain such a rigid diet? Definitely not. Of course, this holy scripture was composed during the first half of the 21st century, and by this stage in our evolution, science has proven, beyond the slightest doubt, that the consumption of animal products is not only unbeneficial to our physiology, they are utterly destroying our health. Humans, like all herbivores, require a nutritious diet, rich in fiber, with a high water content, such as delicious fruits. So, if Homo sapiens sapiens are naturally herbivores, why does at least 99.5% of humankind consume some type of animal product, and even most so-called vegans are not as strict in the diet as they claim? Of course, no extant person could possibly know the exact time, and for the precise reason, a human being first consumed an animal, but it is certainly possible to make educated speculations on the matter. It seems obvious to me, and probably to anyone who is thoroughly convinced that we are natural herbivores, that it was due to a lack of edible vegetation available at the time and place in question. We know for sure that humans originated in the African tropics, and that within 100,000 years, we migrated to most parts of the planet. And, because the frigid regions of the Earth lack a profusion of edible plant life, perhaps our ancestors were compelled to hunt birds, reptiles, and/or mammals, purely in order to survive at least the cold winter months. Forthrightly, even the tropical regions are not always plentiful with wild fruits, a fact that struck me in a hard way, during my lengthy travels throughout the island of Palawan, in the southern Philippines. If it was not for our magnificent human ingenuity in developing agriculture, human populations would probably be comparable to the clusters of our closest relatives, the great apes. This is a worthy argument for the claim that our planet is currently overpopulated, because commercial agriculture, as well as industrialization, has enabled Homo sapiens populations to grow exponentially, thus placing a severe strain upon the biosphere, and unless this trend is reversed, it is almost definite that our planet will become uninhabitable, due to environmental devastation. Furthermore, primatologists have noticed that gorillas occasionally consume tiny vertebrates and insects, at times when their surroundings may lack sufficient edible vegetation. This uncharacteristic behavior of gorillas may be revelatory, in respect to the question of why members of the Homo genus originally began to hunt animals for food as well. Unnatural foodstuffs. Only a veritable troglodyte could possibly take delight in the sight and stench of bloody animal carcasses. Be perfectly honest, when did you, the reader, ever gain an appetite upon the sight of any species of animal? Never, I would suggest. And even if some barbaric person who does, in fact, salivate upon seeing a cow or a turkey, it is more likely that they are imagining the taste of such an animal after it has been cooked, red, pounded into a shriveled mass of dead matter, with salt, spices, herbs, sauces, and other, almost exclusively, plant-based seasonings. Practically all cat owners know to feed their pets with animal flesh, as they understand that felines are obligate carnivores, yet they have not the slightest clue that humans are herbivores biologically, and that the consumption of animal products is gradually destroying their health. Undoubtedly, if everybody was forced to hunt their own animals, the world would become vegan, or at least vegetarian, practically overnight, especially if everyone was required to catch their prey unaided by tools, such as nets and weapons, like an actual carnivore. This undeniable fact is invariably ignored by both carnists and those animal rights activists who attempt to convince carnists to desist from animal abuse. Unjustifiably killing and/or consuming animals is an abominable action. It is not natural for humans to hunt animals like sheep, cows, goats, rabbits, chicken, and fish, and gorge on their eviscerated carcasses. Sheep, rabbits, and cows are food for carnivorous animals such as lions, tigers and wolves, and fish is food for marine and semi-aquatic species. Do humans live in the ocean? Of course not. Then, why is it necessary for us to go into the water to find our food? Is that sensible? Not at all, unless, as previously mentioned, one is afflicted with true hunger. And even in the event that one is literally dying of starvation, one ought to, from a moral perspective, as far as practical, eat those animals that are lower in the hierarchy of sentience, such as seafood. Slaughtering a primate is immensely more sinful than feeding on crustacean, for instance. Lawful animal consumption. Animal consumption is justified only if there is a scarcity of actual food. However, to be fair, some races have adapted reasonably well to an omnivorous diet, due to residing in regions of the Earth where edible vegetation scarcely grows, for millennia before the 20th century. But even then, those races have been found to improve their health, when the diet had been enriched with vegetation. Humans originated in the wetlands of tropical Africa, and our source of food is necessarily to be found in such a clime. We humans must surely be the only species of animal life that migrates away from its food source. If you were situated in the northern hemisphere during the winter, and you witnessed a flock of birds migrating north, away from its feeding grounds, or you happened to observe a lioness fleeing from a herd of wildebeest, it would be reasonable to assume that those animals were afflicted with a rather serious psychological defect. Yet, over the past 50,000 years or so, We humans have moved from the lush tropical forests of the Earth, where our food is found, to the polar regions, where no actual food can be obtained. Who among you would not prefer sweet tropical fruits over the food found in the Arctic Circle or the Antarctic continent? Milk is for infants. Milk is intended solely for consumption by infants of the same species. Cow's milk is for baby cows, not adult humans. The logic of this view is overwhelming, but unfortunately, not all persons are capable of reaching such a base level of logic, in order to understand that it is unnatural for a human to suckle on the teats of a cow, sheep, or goat. Furthermore, like all unnatural substances, dairy products are harmful to human physiology. The majority of humans who have ever lived were lactose intolerant, which is not surprising, considering the facts of the matter. Dietetics. Many persons will undoubtedly criticize this final chapter of Fish for being less than unyieldingly scientific, due mostly to the fact that it lacks much mention of macronutrition or micronutrition facts and figures. For example, one silly man viciously attacked Chapter 30 for asserting that raw fruits were the most important kind of foods for we humans, despite the fact that he is himself a vegan. The reason for omitting extensive mention of nutrition is simply because it is superfluous to both the aim of this chapter and the purpose of the entire scripture. If one has a deficiency in one or more particular nutrient, there is nowadays a wealth of information available to assist one to correct any nutritional imbalance. That is well beyond the scope of this treatise. The thrust of this chapter is to firstly convince readers to desist from any form of animal abuse, and once a strict vegan, to consume foodstuffs in the mode of purity, sattva guna, in Sanskrit, as much as possible, or at least as far as practical. Assuming that the food one eats belongs to this mode, and is not overly modified by genetic manipulation, or by poor soil quality, or even soils poisoned by chemicals or radiation, one can be assured of receiving a nutritionally balanced and delicious diet. After all, for almost the whole of human history, we were totally unaware of the science of nutrition. We simply consumed whatever food to which we were attracted, or in situations where an abundance of actual food, i.e., vegetation, was scarce, whatever was available, even if it was not literally human food, in other words, animals, usually herbivorous creatures, since even carnivores generally avoid preying on fellow carnivores. Furthermore, at the risk of sounding facetious, no other species of animal attends college to study nutrition. They eat whatever foodstuff is peculiar to their genus. Likewise, humans have little need to study nutrition, dietetics, but simply eat what comes natural to us. The source of nutrients. All micronutrients originate from the soil, in combination with the various photosynthetic processes within vegetation. Therefore, there is no requirement for one to gratuitously destroy the lives of poor, innocent animals, in order to receive a nutritionally balanced diet, unless one is literally dying of starvation, of course. Assuming that one eats a variety of the fungal, plant-based foods listed previously, the only essential nutrient that may need to be supplemented in one's diet is vitamin B12, cobalamin, since modern food processing methods tend to irrigate vitamin B12 from raw foods. Even most meat eaters have a deficiency in this vitamin, so B12 deficiency is not endemic to pure vegetarians. Anecdotally, as a strict plant-based eater for over 3 decades, I have adequate cobalamin and iron levels, without the need to supplement. I contend that if all our ancestors consumed a pure diet, sattva guna, in Sanskrit, as defined above, contemporary Homo sapiens would be a vastly superior race, both physically and mentally. Obviously, we would need to have been confined to the tropics and subtropical regions of the planet for this to have eventuated, since the temperate and frigid, polar, zones are not conducive to growing the finer food crops. Processed foodstuffs. For another excellent illustration of what is meant by a natural diet, let us imagine what it would have been like for bread to have come into existence. It is surely reasonable to assume that a person who lived in the Fertile Crescent region of Middle East Asia, approximately 12,000 years ago, did not, one day, walk past a stalk of wheat, and ask himself, I wonder what would happen if I prized out the groats from the head of this plant, pulverized them in a bowl, mix the powder with yeast and water, bake the dough in an oven for half an hour, and consumed the product with a glass of wine. Obviously, it would have taken some length of time, possibly years, or even decades, before the discovery that wheat kernels were somehow edible, most probably by soaking them in water, resulted in the discovery that what came to be known as bread could be made from the tiny seeds of a genus of grass. Therefore, it could be argued that bread is unnatural, in the sense that it is not a food occurring in nature, despite the fact that it was produced by a naturally occurring species of animal life, we human beings. Logically, the more unnatural the food, the less beneficial it must be to human physiology. Therefore, an organically grown pear is obviously far healthier than a highly processed bar of confectionery. Also, applying excessive heat to food destroys some of the nutritional content of the food. On the other hand, cooking food is akin to the first two steps of the digestive process, and enables we humans to reduce our time spent eating, since herbivores are generally grazing animals. For instance, the species nearest to humans, chimpanzees and bonobos, spend many hours per day foraging for edible plant matter to consume. Although cooked food is not always more calorie-dense than raw food, it is easier to masticate and digest, and therefore, one can eat more, in a shorter space of time. This explains the current obesity crisis in the West. See also the entry, logical fallacy, in the glossary, concerning the so-called appeal to nature fallacy, as well as the following subsection. The appeal to nature fallacy. Personally, I have offered fruits to stray cats on several occasions, since, as a vegan, I do not store any animal products in my refrigerator, and without exception, they would just smell the fruit and walk away. Similarly, we need not spend several months of our precious lives studying nutrition, but consume whatever food is natural to our species. Some philosophically inclined individuals have argued that it is natural for humans to do absolutely anything that we actually do. For example, it is natural for humanity to invent technological devices such as airplanes, computers, and microwave ovens, and once we develop the tools to produce weaponry, to use those weapons to kill animals, and then cook them in an oven or on a stove, and eat them. That definition of natural is certainly valid, and I actually agree with it, at least in principle. However, when it is stated that it is unnatural for humans to consume animals, I am referring to a truly natural scenario, in which we ignore the fact that humans have produced spears, knives, and guns, and go out into the wild, to forage for our daily meal, just as Homo sapiens and extinct hominins have done for millions of years. In that case, how many persons would prefer to chase a wild boar or a fowl, if the nearby trees were plentiful with sweet, juicy, healthy, delicious fruits? About 1% of the population, if even that, I would posit. And those men, since it would almost invariably be adult males, who would rather pounce on a cow or goat, and rip open its body, in order to feast on its gory remains, instead of plucking a bunch of grapes from a vine, are naught but barbaric troglodytes, who probably make grunting sounds, instead of speaking any known language. Some so-called philosophers would undoubtedly accuse me of committing the logical fallacy known as the appeal to nature fallacy, but in this instance, it is definitely not a fallacy, but a profoundly logical argument, otherwise they ought to feed pork sausages, or even live chickens to a pet rabbit, and see how supposedly fallacious is that argument. Cf. Logical fallacy, in the glossary. The definitive definition of veganism. In most instances within this book, the term vegan is used according to its perfect definition, meaning, to understand what the individual who coined the word had in mind when he coined the word, and devising a new definition that comports with authentic ethics, instead of any of the past or present definitions supplied by the Vegan Society of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, all of which are fundamentally flawed. The perfect, though not necessarily the most succinct, definition of veganism is as follows, NB. A more succinct definition is given below. Veganism is the ideology, or in order to put it rather more accurately, the normative ethical position, that human beings ought to desist from unjustifiably harming non-human animal life, either directly or indirectly, justifiable harm, being customarily defined as that harm caused to a non-human animal as a result of self-defense. Consuming non-human animals, preferably those species of animalia that are quite low in their evolutionary scale, as far as practical, due to true hunger, as a consequence of a lack of edible vegetation. Non-human animals that were duly harmed in the process of testing, manufacturing and/or marketing medical treatments for serious maladies, when a less harmful alternative was impossible, or at least highly impractical, to procure. Any unintentional, accidental harm that may be caused to non-human animals as a result of reasonable human activity, such as various recreational activities, constructing residential and commercial buildings, growing and transporting food crops, traveling by foot, air, or powered vehicles. And of course, eradicating vermin from one's dwelling place or from one's workplace, if a catch and release strategy is impractical, all of which conforms to the most exigent understanding of law, morality, ethics, more appositely termed dharma, in Sanskrit, as expertly explicated in the only genuine holy scripture that has ever been composed, FISH. Additionally, the term vegan is often applied, adjectively, to any product or service that was created or performed without causing undue harm, that is, without causing any morally unjustifiable harm, to any non-human animal, e.g. a horseback riding class, would count as carnist. A far more accurate term to use for such vegan products would probably be either plant-based or artificial, man-made. Obviously, the idea of veganism implies the avoidance of using any product of animal origin for food, clothing, etc., as far as practicable, according to the principles of Dharma, comprehensively delineated in the all-important 12th chapter of this, a final instruction sheet for humanity. Ideally, because there exists no descriptor for a human being who does not commit the sin of theft, or any other crime for that matter, except perhaps the word teetotaler, there ought not be a term for a human who desists from harming animals unduly. Hopefully, one day soon, the vast majority of humans will become compassionate vegans, thus rendering the term vegan, as well as vegetarian, redundant. Of course, it is preferred that all humans become vegans according to the above definition, since the official definition is profoundly inconsistent. Essentially, veganism is meta-morality applied to the animal kingdom, and thus, it is a characteristic of normative ethics, or applied ethics. So, in other words, any unjustifiable harm caused to any living being is immoral, and veganism is simply one facet of this principle of non-harm. The Vegan Society's flawed definition of veganism. The Vegan Society's definition of veganism has been amended and refined over the years. The current definition is overly verbose, apart from the fact that it suffers from sloppy grammar, as well as a sirology, since veganism is scarcely a philosophy, and reads as follows. Veganism is a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of, and cruelty to, animals for food, clothing or any other purpose. And by extension, promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans and the environment. In dietary terms it denotes the practice of dispensing with all products derived wholly or partly from animals. N.B. Previous Vegan Society definitions were somewhat less awkward, so one may like to research those definitions. The most problematic article in this witless definition of veganism is the phrase encompassed by the two dashes. The initial clause, as far as is possible, is rather contradictory to the following clause, as far as is practicable, that is, able to be put into practice. The former clause, possible, is simply superfluous, and is made redundant by the second clause, practicable. Theoretically, it is possible to go to extreme lengths in order to avoid animal exploitation, but this is hardly practicable by any human who is living a worthwhile existence, so the clause, practicable, alone is required. When the perfect definition of veganism, provided in the previous subsection, is studied, it ought to be clear that, by far the best term to use instead of possible and practicable, is unjustified. Is it possible for me to attempt to catch the hundreds of mosquitoes that enter my dwelling each day, here in the tropics, and set them outside my house? Possibly, yes. However, is it practical for me to do so, since it would require a considerable amount of valuable time? Absolutely not. The life of an unconscious insect is relatively insignificant, compared to that of a human being, especially one who is a member of the holy priesthood, the world teacher himself, in my particular case. Of course, this ought not imply that one should intentionally kill insects that one happens across during one's morning jog, or whilst strolling through a public botanical garden. This would constitute unjustified harm, unless, of course, the insect was attacking one. This position, though eminently logical and dharmic, may not be accepted by the most obsessively fanatical vegans, because, just like the most fervent pseudo-religious fanatics, as well as the most rabid feminists and communists, they are afflicted with a very close-minded mentality. Furthermore, at the risk of seeming rather trivial, contrary to the above definition, veganism is neither a philosophy, nor is it a way of life. Veganism is purely an ethical position, or to put it even more tersely, it is simply a moral disposition towards non-human animals, that they ought not be harmed unduly, and it falls firmly in the realm of normative ethics. Morality, as explained in the 12th chapter of this solitary holy scripture, FISH, entails nothing more than avoiding unjustified harm to any living being, and conversely, executing beneficial actions. Just as the terms racism, sexism, and speciesism have been discredited in the glossary of this book, the term veganism, too, is flawed. Of course, this is conditional upon the premise that the aforementioned four words are defined as they are by most dictionaries, as well as by most humans, in the case of the first two, or by the two Englishmen who defined the latter two terms. There is sufficient evidence that the term vegan, when first coined by the founder of the Vegan Society, Mr. Donald Watson, with auxiliary input from his then future wife, Miss Dorothy, in the year 1944 CE, initially referred to a dietary usage of the word, but soon afterwards morphed into a definition founded upon the ethical treatment of animals, though worded rather differently by the Vegan Society. Mr. and Mrs. George A. Henderson were influential in the development of the term early on, and in the year 1949, Mr. Leslie J. Cross was responsible for codifying the term to mean, to seek an end to the use of animals by man for food, commodities, work, hunting, vivisection, and by all other uses involving exploitation of animal life by man. If the reader has carefully studied the all-important 12th chapter of this holy treatise, he or she should be able to guess why this definition is problematic. Moral culpability is predicated on any intentional harm that cannot be properly justified by the perpetrator. Therefore, the above definition ought to have included the qualification, unjustified, and thus, have read, to seek an end to the unjustified use of animals. Informally, Mr. Cross used the following abbreviated definition: the doctrine that man should live without exploiting animals. The definition proffered by this author, above, fully encompasses the ideology of veganism, far more definitively. A far greatly more concise definition would be, veganism is the ethical position that humans ought to desist from unjustifiably harming non-human animal life. In other words, there is no need to use the term veganism if one is conversant with metaethics, since the definition of the word moral includes all actions that result in unjustified harm, and not only those actions that harm non-human animals. Again, this topic was thoroughly explained in Chapter 12. See also, Carnist, in the glossary. Quite parenthetically, Vegan Society founder, Mr. Donald Watson, lived to the ripe old age of 95 years, despite his critics informing him that he will soon die, as a consequence of his newly adopted diet. How amazing it is that a fully herbivorous species of animal, we humans, can be completely healthy on our natural diet, would you not agree? Yes, I am being sarcastic. Animal rights. As a promoter of animal rights, or to be far more precise and accurate, the one and only right of animals, and of all living organisms for that matter, and that is, to not be harmed without proper justification, I, the author of this most important work of literature, frequently survey my fellow vegans, regarding their personal definitions of the term vegan. According to my informal research, almost all so-called vegans proffer a wholly inadequate definition of the word, and in many cases, provide a definition that has almost nothing whatever to do with the concept of veganism. One reason for this discrepancy is simply due to the fact that only a certain percentage of those who identify as vegan are in fact vegan, something that I often discover after further questioning. Most of these self-identifying vegans are either plant-based eaters, in other words, literal vegetarians, or lacto-vegetarians from the Indian subcontinent, who unknowingly conflate the word vegan with vegetarian. This suggests that, statistically, actual vegans comprise a tiny fraction of 1% of the global population, sad to say. So, the concept of animal rights cannot, and should not, be separated from the one and only right of all living creatures, as defined in the previous paragraph. Do plants and fungus have rights? Yes, and no, because, as I need to keep reminding the reader, there is but a singular right, and not plural rights. Plants, too, should not be harmed without proper justification. If I recklessly pull out a rose bush from the front yard of my asrama, presbytery, for no apparent reason, that constitutes undue harm, and it could be seen as a sin, in a non-theistic sense of the word. On the other hand, if I kill the plant because my 2-year-old toddler is constantly falling face first into the rosebush during his playtime, then I could be justified in destroying the plant, but preferably, repositioning it in a safer location, or giving it to a friend or a neighbor. P.S. Because veganism is a purely moral, or ethical, concept, it is not possible to be an accidental vegan. Therefore, a child who is raised by vegan parents or guardians cannot rightly call himself or herself vegan, unless he or she shares the moral disposition of her superiors. Likewise, a man who resides in a location where animal products are unavailable, and consequently, subsists entirely on plants, cannot be a genuine vegan, unless, of course, he acknowledges the right of non-humans to not be harmed unduly. He is merely a plant-based consumer. Similarly, those vegans who claim that their pets are fed vegan food are in error, because neither food, nor their animals, can make the moral decision to be vegan. Instead, it would be more accurate for them to say that they feed their pets a fully plant-based diet. Furthermore, it is logically impossible, or at least extremely discordant, for a person to claim to be an ex-vegan, for this would entail supplanting the belief that non-human animals are morally significant, with the contradictory position. Once a vegan, always a vegan, is the only consistent position. Speciesism. Although the notion of speciesism is not directly associated with diet, or arguably even with veganism, its glossary entry has been repeated here in this chapter, due to the fact that most vegans seem to be in favor of the objectively evil ideology, adharma, in Sanskrit, of anti-speciesism. Yes, counterintuitively for most humans, it is actually a holy and righteous concept, dharma, in Sanskrit, to be a speciesist. Not only that, but those utterly hypocritical vegans who assert that speciesism is evil, hateful, bad, wrong, will reveal their abject hypocrisy when they invariably favor the interests of members of their own species, in cases such as the scenario in which they are forced to save the life of either a fellow human being, or else rescuing a cat, a dog, or a pet budgerigar that is drowning in a pool of water, or burning in a house fire. British psychologist, Dr. Richard Hood Jack Dudley Ryder, who coined the term in a 1970 leaflet entitled Speciesism, defined it as a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species, and against those of members of other species. Consequently, anti-speciesism seems to be an egalitarian position, similar to the ideologies of anti-racism, which, at least in the minds of the vast majority of humans, advocates for the fundamental equality of all races and ethnicities, and anti-sexism. See also the glossary entries, racism, and sexism, which amply demonstrate that it is factually dharmic to be both a racist and a sexist, at least pursuant to the standard definitions of the terms, as well as according to the correct, etymological definition of the word, discriminate. In the animal rights movement, the term, speciesism, normally entails the belief that all species of animal life are fundamentally equal. This view is an extremist position, bordering on pathological, as it contradicts basic principles of biological science and applied ethics. See Chapter 12 of this, a final instruction sheet for humanity, in order to properly understand both meta-ethics, as well as normative ethics. Anybody who believes that all animal species are equal in moral value, will not be able to sustain that view when confronted with the option of destroying the life of either a gnat or a housefly, or that of a fellow human being, or even a rodent or a rabbit. Equality is non-existent in this macro sphere. Equality exists solely in abstract concepts, such as mathematics. For instance, 1 plus 1 is precisely equal to 2, and arguably on the atomic and quantum levels, for example, 2 hydrogen atoms are essentially identical, as are 2 gluon or muon subatomic particles. Opposition to speciesism is a truly inane philosophical position, because, according to the principles of Dharma, see that entry in the glossary, as well as Chapter 12, it is normal, natural, and necessary for a member of any particular species of animal to have a preference for individuals of its own species. The negation, or the suppression, of in-group preference, especially in the case of humans' preference for members of their own species in survival situations, is adharmic, meaning to say, is unlawful, even if a higher species of life was to threaten our own species. For example, if a pack of wolves was hunting a herd of deer, why would one of the deer encourage a family member to run in the direction of the wolves? This would be counterintuitive and detrimental to the deer's own species. If a race of superior aliens was to take over the world, what kind of Homo sapiens would assist the aliens to conquer our own planet? Only a human who was mentally deranged, I would posit, unless that human believed that the destruction of humanity would be truly beneficial to the planet, and even then, the typical human would seriously question the sanity of that individual, as it seems to contradict common civility. Thus, in-group preferences may be morally justified. Therefore, to claim that it is immoral for a human being to be biased towards members of his or her own species, in most every circumstance, is blatantly erroneous, just as it is fallacious to assert that one should not be partial towards one's gender or to one's race, in specific cases. If you happened upon a lion or a tiger, mauling a fellow human being who was attacking the cat's family, would you consider that big cat to be evil, immoral, or simply wrong in its behavior towards the human? Most probably not, because if you were sufficiently wise and intelligent, you would realize that the lion or the tiger was merely acting on its natural in-group instinctual preferences. On the contrary, in fact, if any non-human animal was to assist a Homo sapiens to attack its own family members, one would be fully warranted in assuming that the animal was afflicted with some kind of psychological abnormality. Thus, speciesism is an entirely morally justified position to hold. Ch. 12. I have a particularly hilarious anecdote in relation to the insane, irrational, delusional ideology known as anti-speciesism, as follows. An Englishman whom I once befriended on a social media website, and with whom I engaged in a lengthy audio-visual call, informed me that he would gladly sacrifice his life, for the life of a cockroach that may be killed in the home of a vegan who believes that it is morally justifiable to exterminate vermin, as do I, within reason, of course. And just in case one may believe that he was not actually serious, this author can assure the reader that he was indeed serious in his statement. I know him quite well, and because his understanding of both metaethics and normative ethics is poor, he truly would sacrifice himself for a mere insect, although, I cannot imagine that he would actually go through with the deed, if the situation presented itself to him. Such is the hypocritical nature of egalitarian, weak leftists, adharmavadan, in Sanskrit. Therefore, according to the definition of speciesism, given above, I, the author of this holiest of all holy scriptures, am exceedingly proud to be among those rare, sane vegans who consider my own species to be of greater moral value than the life of a microbe or a fruit fly. This does not imply that I would wantonly destroy the life of an inferior animal, simply for the fact that it is not human, but that I would most definitely choose to destroy the life of an animal of another species in the case of self-defense, in order to survive a famine, or in order to protect my food supply, all of which adheres to the most philosophically correct, definitive definition of the word, vegan, already provided in a previous subsection. As a general rule, in order to avoid hypocrisy, one ought not exterminate vermin from one's home or workplace if one is unwilling to kill the animal with one's bare hands. In my particular case, for example, I am completely comfortable smacking a mosquito or an ant that is crawling on my skin, but I could never bring myself to catch a rodent with my bare hands, and bash it to death with my fists, or even more horrifically, strangle its neck, squeezing the life out of it. Rather, I would prefer to trap it in a cage, and later, release it at a distant location. So, obviously, I would never, and could never, at least psychologically, murder a cow, a goat, a rabbit, or a pig, even if I was dying of starvation. Consequently, according to the singular, authentic law, dharma, in Sanskrit, the rule that ought to be followed, is that the higher a species falls on the evolutionary scale, the more morally valuable it is. I am certain that you, the reader, would instinctively attempt to rescue a dog or a rabbit, over a drowning insect or a lizard. Of course, it is not implied that every human intuition is morally correct, yet, in this particular case, it indeed conforms to genuine dharma. Incidentally, this pyramidic hierarchy of animal sentience, consciousness, applies within the human species too. See the subsections regarding moral dilemmas, and the ethics of abortion, in Chapter 12, where, in the latter subsection, it is noted that the life of an embryo is not as morally valuable as that of a 5-year-old child, for instance. It seems glaringly obvious to me that the typical person, when confronted with the choice of rescuing either a 5-year-old child, or a batch of 100 frozen zygotes, would immediately and impulsively decide to save the 5-year-old child. See also, sentience, in the glossary of this holiest of all holy scriptures, especially if you happen to be a vegan advocate or an animal rights activist, because contrary to what practically every person in the vegan movement believes, all life is definitionally sentient. The term, sentience, is invariably conflated with consciousness by most all activists. In summary, speciesism, as defined by the Englishman who coined the term, as well as those fools who accede to his objectively evil ideology, such as my fellow countryman, the devilish Dr. Peter Singer, a truly perverse ignoramus, is a legitimate, sane and rational position to hold. Yet, if Dr. Ryder had included the clause, speciesism is an unjustified prejudice or attitude of bias, in favor of the interests of members of one's own species, and against those of members of other species, in his definition of the word, it would hold a completely legitimate tenor. Undoubtedly, one of the main reasons why so many so-called vegans are unfamiliar with even the Vegan Society's definition of veganism, what to speak of the perfect definition, is due to the fact that the overwhelming percentage of those who are attracted to veganism, even in conservative nations, are afflicted with a leftist, social justice mentality, and of course, they are invariably anti-speciesist, in keeping with their silly, egalitarian ideology. Thus, their specious adherence to veganism is motivated more by the desire to be seen as fair, just, and equitable, rather than genuinely moral. And because such vegans and animal rights activists, like practically every human who ever lived, are unable to properly convey the correct ethical justifications for veganism, they will fail to persuade the majority of humanity to refrain from animal abuse. Common arguments against veganism. Carnists claim that animal products contain certain macronutrients or micronutrients that are unobtainable from plant foods. First of all, such carnists seem to be oblivious to the fact that most species of Animalia are herbivores, what to speak of the fact that all nutrients originate from plants. My own response to this argument is, from where do the cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens get the insert name of nutrient? Carnists claim that animal products taste delicious. However, this is, in almost every case, due to the fact that those animal products are enhanced with plant-based additives, such as sauces, spices, herbs, and other condiments and seasonings, as well as the fact that their sense of taste has been adulterated since birth, to become accustomed to the taste of meat, eggs, and/or dairy products. If carnists were compelled to hunt their own game, unaided by any artificial weapons or nets, and devour the animal immediately upon capture, Just as most carnivorous and omnivorous species do, I wonder how many of them would make the claim that meat tastes good. Well under 1%, I would say. Carnists claim that the production of plant foods causes undue harm to animal species, such as insects and rodents. This is one of the most inane arguments against veganism, since animal husbandry requires even more animal destruction, because animals require plant foods in order to grow. Furthermore, certain harmful deeds can be justified according to the principles of law, morality, ethics, discussed in Chapter 12. The singular argument for veganism. As demonstrated already, human beings, like their closest relatives, the apes, are a fully herbivorous species, hunting animals only when there is a scarcity of plant food, and only then, by those humans who are rather base and ignoble, for a true lady or a gentleman would never stoop so low as to murder an innocent, defenseless animal. Therefore, there is no need to consume animal products, unless one is afflicted with true hunger. Likewise, there is no need to use products derived from animals for purposes other than food, such as leather, fur or ivory, because in virtually every instance, it is not difficult to find a plant product or an inorganic substance that will amply serve one's requirements. Right pointing arrow go vegan, according to the perfect definition of the term, without apology to the well-intentioned founders of the Vegan Society of U.K. And God said, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. Genesis 1:29, the Old Testament portion of the Judeo-Christian Holy Bible. Author uncertain. But although a man may wear fine clothing, if he lives peacefully, and is good, self-possessed, has faith and is pure, and if he does not hurt any living being, he is a holy Brahmana, priest, a renunciate, a monk. The wise who hurt no living being by practicing non-violence, and who keep their body under self-control, they go to the immortal nirvana, where once gone they sorrow no more. A man is not great because he is a warrior and kills other men, but because he hurts not any living being, he in truth is called a Brahmana. Dhammapada 142, 225, and 405. Gautama Buddha, see also Chapter 8, on meat eating, from the Lankavatara Sutra, the essence of the teaching of all the Buddhas. Let food be thy medicine, and let medicine be thy food. Hippocrates of Kos, father of modern medicine. My body will not be a tomb for other creatures. Leonardo da Vinci, Italian painter and polymath. The assumption that animals are without rights and the illusion that our treatment of them has no moral significance is a positively outrageous example of Western crudity and barbarity. Universal compassion is the only guarantee of morality. Compassion for animals is intimately associated with goodness of character, and it may be confidently asserted that he who is cruel to animals cannot be a good man. Compassion is the basis of morality. From The Basis of Morality. Arthur Schopenhauer, German philosopher. There is no fundamental difference between humans and animals in their ability to feel pleasure and pain, happiness and misery. Charles Robert Darwin, English naturalist, geologist and biologist. Of course, this is a gross generalization, since not all species of animals possess consciousness. Ahimsa is the highest duty. Even if we cannot practice it in full, we must try to understand its spirit and refrain, as far as is humanly possible, from violence. The way to truth lies through ahimsa, non-violence. The greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. I hold that the more helpless a creature, the more entitled it is to protection by humans from the cruelty of humans. The most violent weapon on earth is the table fork. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Indian law practitioner, meaning, he studied and defended the subjective rules and regulations of England, South Africa, and Bharata, India. P.S. Like most vegetarians and vegans, Gandhi considered animals to be human food, despite humans being factually herbivores, by nature. When I see bacon, I see a pig, I see a little friend, and that's why I can't eat it. Simple as that. Sir James Paul McCartney. English singer, songwriter. Copyright 2019-2025 Spiritual Sciences Society.